and then go to Luke, the 18th chapter, verses 31 through 34. I will be reading from the Common English Bible. You can read along with me or listen as I read. Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. At that time, some Pharisees approached Jesus and said, "Go, get away from here, because Herod wants to kill you." Jesus said to them, "Go tell that fox, look, I'm throwing out demons and healing people today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will complete my work. However, it's necessary for me to travel today, tomorrow, and the next day, because it's impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed prophets and stoned those who were sent to you. How often have I wanted to gather your people, just as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings? But you didn't want that. Look, your house is abandoned. I tell you, you won't see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessings on the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" The 18th chapter, verses 31 through 34. Jesus took the 12 aside and said, "Look, we're going up to Jerusalem, and everything written about the human one by the prophets will be accomplished. He will be handed over to the Gentiles. He will be ridiculed, mistreated, and spit on. After torturing him, they will kill him. On the third day, he will rise up." But the 12 understood none of these words. The meaning of this message was hidden from them, and they didn't grasp what he was saying. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. For the time that we have together this evening, I would like to preach from the subject, the human one. The human one. The widely read and hotly debated book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth by Reza Aslan, a Ph.D. trained religious scholar and New York Times best-selling author, opens with the bold and provocative assertion, "It is a miracle that we know anything at all about this man called Jesus of Nazareth." I repeat, it is a miracle that we know anything at all about this man called Jesus of Nazareth. Throughout this work of narrative religious history, Aslan paints a vivid picture of first-century Palestine as a sprawling land chock full of rival sects, posturing tribes, and dueling city-nation-states, each with his own flavor, culture, economy, style, religious sensibilities, and leadership structures that make for a super region that borders on being unwieldy and absolutely ungovernable. This vast territory was ruled under the authority of the Roman Emperor Tiberius through a patchwork of governors, prelates, judges, and indigenous local loyalists. In each community, this governance structure was unique in character, as deals were made with local religious leaders and communal power brokers who were incentivized to maintain order and decorum, to prevent dissension among their ranks, to squelch any protest that may emerge, and to keep any public unease or unrest at bay. While this coalition of appointed regional officials and local enforcers was politically shrewd, it was not altogether effective. According to Aslan's historical reconstruction, religious zealots and political crusaders in first-century Palestine under Roman rule came a dime a dozen. Every community had at least one and sometimes multiple competing rabble-rousers who claimed divine authority and power to either overthrow the oppressive rule of Rome or to lead all those who were willing to follow to a promised land in this life or the next, where the peace of God would reign, where love and justice would abound, where the lion would lay down next to the lamb, and where the necessary swords of revolutionary revolt would be beaten into plowshares worthy of harvesting the soon coming abundance. In this context, the presence of a disciple recruiting, messianic figure claiming a spiritual and political mandate to restore righteousness, justice, and social order would have not been at all uncommon or unfamiliar. When one of these charismatic figures became too popular or was deemed a threat to either the local power structure or the Roman rule, they were routinely arrested, exiled, beaten, scorned, and in the most derisive and dangerous cases, crucified. Yet, despite the many dime a dozen zealots who assembled ragtag bands of disciples who gave up everything they possessed to follow these charismatic figures who claimed to be the Son of God, the Messianic hope, the Anointed One, the prophet, or the voice crying in the wilderness, it is indeed a historical miracle that 2,000 years later, we continue to read, to refer to teach and preach from, and build movements and institutions around this grand collection of stories called Gospels that have been passed down from generation to generation about one particular zealot and rabble-rouser, a man from Nazareth, the brother of James and the son of Mary and Joseph the carpenter, named Jesus. I appreciate the decision of the translation committee of the Common English Bible to use the more direct language, the human one, to describe Jesus, rather than the familiar and descriptive epithet, the Son of Man, that is used in other contemporary translations. Such a linguistic move became necessary as the designation Son of Man has become interchangeable with claims of Jesus' divine uniqueness, such as the common references to Jesus as the Son of Man, a term used to suggest exclusive particularity, rather than it being employed to illuminate the reality and import of Jesus' full humanity. It is a rich interpretive blessing to be reminded that Jesus the Christ, the man from Galilee, the Son of God, Mary's baby, the suffering servant, the Paschal Lamb, the gift of Christmas, and the second person in the Trinity was indeed human. Not only was he human, but it is my contention that it was the very depth and breadth of his humanity that provided the rich soil into which his divine purpose was planted and from which his messianic mission continues to flourish. What is your evidence of this grand humanity? In his response to the warning of the Pharisees that Herod was seeking to kill him in Luke the 13th chapter, we are afforded a window into the qualitative difference between Jesus and the other insurrectionist leaders who preceded him and who continue to emerge in the towns and villages of Palestine. You see, Jesus' focus was not on self-aggrandizement, on building influence and political capital, on benefiting from the benevolence of disciples, or seeking increasingly larger public stages from which to bolster his reputation and to recruit new followers. You see, Jesus did not avoid his detractors, but neither was he eager to seek them out in a quest to defend his actions and to vindicate his reputation. Jesus was people-focused and mission-minded. While acknowledging that it was inevitable that he would soon have to march into Jerusalem to give a defense of himself before the imperial powers of Rome and the local leaders who would stand in judgment of him on charges of sedition and inciting insurrection, Jesus was focused on the work that needed to be done where he was and with the people who needed to hear, see, and believe that liberation was possible physically, spiritually, emotionally, and socially. Yes, traveling to Jerusalem was on the agenda, but so was healing the sick, ministering to those in need, and affirming the humanity of those who were outcast and marginalized. Between the acknowledgement of inevitability of the final journey to Jerusalem in chapter 13 and the triumphant entry into the city on the back of a colt with crowds shouting blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord in chapter 19, the depth of Jesus' compassionate and benevolent humanity was on full display as he offered what I consider to be the prototypical course in miracles between chapter 13 and chapter 19. This course in miracles was not necessarily mystical or magical. It was rooted in the muck and mire of ministry that would require him to go where others refused to go, to touch those that others had labeled as unclean, to visit with those deemed by religious leaders as sinful, licentious, derelict, and hopelessly lost. Yes, Jesus did the extraordinary. He loosed a woman from an unknown infirmity and healed a man suffering from dropsy on 2 consecutive visits to the Galilean temple on the Sabbath. Yes, he healed 10 lepers as he was passing through Samaria. Yes, he restored the sight of a blind beggar on the road to Jericho. But the extraordinary was no substitute for the more mundane and unglamorous aspects of Jesus' ministry. He took time to teach his disciples and others through parables. He responded to his critics and detractors. He spoke to the multitudes that followed him, declaring that anyone who does not take up their cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. He took time out of his day to bless little children. He counseled a rich young ruler, telling him not what he wanted to hear, but what he needed to hear. And then he invited himself to be the house guest of the chief tax collector named Zacchaeus, who was universally derided as sinful and greedy for sustaining a lavish lifestyle by unfairly and illegally taxing the poor and working class who were essentially powerless without a public voice or legal recourse. Yes, he ate with tax collectors and sinners. Given the socio-historical climate of first-century Palestine that was replete with political protest and religious zealotry, Jesus' claims to be the Son of God were not particularly unique or even exceptional. Charisma, bold claims of spiritual agency, and calls for social reform were all a part of the familiar messianic playbook of the day. But what was unique about Jesus was that he actually practiced what he preached. He actually believed when he said he believed. He did what he said he was going to do, and he promised to others not only was he going to do it, but he said, greater works than these shall you do. Jesus' message to his disciples in the 18th chapter of Mark makes it clear that he was fully aware of the personally perilous implications of his continued ministry outside the bounds of religious and political appropriateness, yet this prophetic foreshadowing would not be used as an excuse to go into hiding as others had, to turn around as others did, to recant claims of divine authority, or to cease the public display of his spiritual power. While the gospel writer records that the 12 did not understand what Jesus was saying, this brief lesson planted the seeds for the rapid development of the followers of Jesus from a ragtag group of zealous disciples on one hand into an organized group of evangelists who committed their lives to sharing the good news that Jesus was indeed the Christ, not only because of how he died, but most importantly, because of how he lived. The narrative of the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, who was resurrected as Jesus the Christ, has spiritual power, historical permanence, and social gravitas because he touched people who touched other people who continue to touch even more people whose lives were transformed and made the better by these encounters. So today, we, the sons and daughters of humanity, have become the sons and daughters of God, all because a man from Nazareth who was not afraid to march into Jerusalem, yet who refused to be forced to stand in judgment before his time. He knew that the work he was called to do on the front end of that marching, healing, teaching, liberating, and empowering would be just as important, if not more important, than the ultimate sacrifice that was soon coming on the back end. Yes, Jesus knew that he had to go to Jerusalem. Yes, Jesus knew that he had to face Pontius Pilate. Yes, Jesus knew that he would be beaten, scorned, marked. Yes, Jesus knew that he would be crucified. And yes, he even knew that he would be resurrected on the third day. And yes, he knew that his disciples, who didn't understand what he was saying at that time, when time came, would understand who he was and what he was called to do, so that they could then go and make more disciples, who would then go and make more disciples and build churches and build synagogues and build temples and build schools and build community centers and build families and build communities, so that the world would know that Jesus Christ, yes, he was a man, but yes, Jesus Christ is also Lord. And yes, because Jesus Christ came, because he lived, because he died, because he was resurrected, we can live also, and we can manifest day in and day out the spiritual, physical, social, and emotional power that Jesus made manifest not only in Jerusalem, Galilee, and Judea, but even throughout the world. Yeah. So yes, King Chapel, Reza Aslan is right. It is a miracle that we know anything at all about this man called Jesus of Nazareth.